All right, so let's get going on today's class. So today we're going to be switching gears. We're going to leave classical conditioning behind, and we are now going to start with the other major form of learning, which is operant conditioning. But before we get to that, just a reminder that tonight is the Comic Books and Psychology event hosted by the IUSB Psychology Club. So that's going to be tonight at 5:30. It's going to be in the cafeteria next to the grill. Come for the Comic Books and Psychology, stay for the free food and drinks. No need to RSVP at this point, just show up at that time. And I'll let you know about one of the new interesting and innovative new areas of research and the sort of results and insights that it's telling us about how our minds work. All right, so today we're going to be taking a look at operant conditioning. So again, we've been dealing with classical conditioning. I mentioned before that classical conditioning is one of the two major types of learning that have been studied. Operant conditioning is the other one. So we'll take a look at operant conditioning. We'll define some terms: operant behavior, operant consequences, operant antecedents. And then we'll take a look at the 4 types of contingencies: positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, which everybody in popular culture gets wrong, positive punishment and negative punishment, and then finally have a word on shaping. Now, on a side note, hopefully everybody's seen the announcement. I've extended the deadlines for the SNFI assignments for assignments 4 through 14. They got pushed back, mostly because I don't know exactly what happened, but we're not going to be able to cover what I want to cover before you need to do those assignments. So I've pushed them back so that we have enough time to go over what I'm expecting, introduce the ideas, and then you have time to do that homework. So please make a note of that. I wasn't able to update the syllabus, but I did update in Canvas all the due dates for that for those SNFI assignments. So double check those, and just know that we will cover what I expect in class before you are required to complete those SNFI assignments. But what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be talking about operant conditioning, and shaping is one of the things that you will do in one of your SNFI assignments, where you actually shape SNFI's behavior until he is able to bar press, learns that particular behavior. So operant conditioning is basically the type of learning that is used anytime that you practice a skill, anytime that you develop a new behavior that you weren't able to do before. That is an example of operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is what would take a novice, just beginning student piano player all the way up to a concert pianist. Operant conditioning is what takes you from being able to play chopsticks to being able to play, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. So because we're leaving behind classical conditioning, we're going to have to leave behind Pavlov's dog, and instead we're going to get Skinner's rat, and we're going to take a look at how operant conditioning works, how operant conditioning differs from classical conditioning and some of the terms. But again, operant conditioning is the main form of learning that occurs, or that is in effect, when you learn new behaviors, when you learn new skills. So we've seen examples of operant conditioning before, but let's just take a new look at some. So if you are a fan of the Westminster Dog Show, you might have seen examples of rather complicated behaviors. Video unavailable? I don't think so. One moment. Not share, not watch later. All right, let's do this the old-fashioned way. All right, if you're a fan of the Westminster Dog Show, and you're also a fan of seamless recoveries when technology doesn't work, If you're a fan of Dove's Men Care Plus Skin. Alrighty. It's great when it works. Here we go. All right, so all of that. We started around 20 seconds. All right, everything this dog is doing, all of this behavior, all of this complicated, where do I go, what do I do, running through the tunnel, especially the one between the pegs. This little move right here. All right, all of that is operant conditioning. All right, you cannot get a dog to do this through classical conditioning. Everything that this dog is able to do, all these behaviors. Dog is fast. All right, so everything that dog is able to do has been trained through operant conditioning. Not bad. All right. So again, we're going to see how operant conditioning operates, how it, what the procedures are. Basically, how do you create that learning condition for that particular behavior? So operant conditioning, the key difference between classical conditioning and operant conditioning is that operant conditioning is learning that occurs where the future probability of a behavior is affected by its consequences. And that's the key difference here. So it's still learning. So classical conditioning was learning, operant conditioning is still learning. It's still this rather permanent change in behavior because of previous occurrences. But in this case, the future probability of a behavior is affected. That's also like classical conditioning. So in operant conditioning, for example, bar presses will become more probable in the future. In classical conditioning, salivating will become more probable in the future. However, the key difference is that in operant conditioning, that future probability of a behavior is affected by its consequences. And it's those consequences that are the key difference between classical and operant conditioning. Because whether or not the dog got the food, whether or not the dog whether or not the dog salivated when the bell was rung, all of that was inconsequential. So it wasn't that Pavlov rang the bell and then said, ooh, if the dog salivates, I'll give them some food. No, Pavlov was just doing what Pavlov was doing. He was ringing the bell, here's some food. He was ringing the bell, here's some food. And then one day he noticed he was ringing the bell and the dog was salivating. There was no change in what Pavlov was doing due to the behavior of the dog, and that's classical conditioning. Operant conditioning, however, the behavior is actually followed by consequences for the behavior. And those consequences are what, as we're going to see, makes that behavior more likely to occur in the future. So your rat is going to be more likely to bar press, or different consequences will make that probability go down so that your rat is less likely to bar press. But it's that idea of the behavior leading to consequences that is the key difference between operant conditioning and classical conditioning. So what are some of the terms for operant conditioning? Well, we have the operant behavior. This is behavior that is being learned or trained. So this is the class of emitted responses that result in certain consequences. So they give it this definition that it's a class of emitted behaviors, a class of emitted responses, because oftentimes there's more than one way to do something. So for example, when Sniffy is bar pressing, Sniffy can bar press with his front two legs, Sniffy can bar press with his face, Sniffy can bar press with his butt. As long as the bar press occurs, that leads to certain consequences. So oftentimes a bunch of different behaviors, a class of behaviors can result in certain consequences. So it's a class of emitted responses that result in certain consequences. That's the operant behavior. And those consequences are what affect the future probability of those operant behaviors, those emitted responses. So the consequences either make those emitted responses go up in probability, or they make them go down in probability. So these operant behaviors, you'll also see them referred to as operant responses, or just as operant. We're going to try to keep them consistent and call them operant behavior as much as we can, but don't get confused if you see this in other places and other readings that you're doing. So an example of this, the classic example, the lever press. Lever press, in this case, you see that it's in italics. Operant conditioning carries over a lot of the language or terms that was used in classical conditioning. So the lever press, that is the operant behavior. It's in italics. It's like the target behavior. And that operant behavior actually causes, hence the arrow, food to be delivered. And food is the consequence. So lever press causes food. Lever press is the operant behavior. Food is the consequence. And the behavior can lead to different consequences. So lever press, the operant might lead to the consequence of shock. And in that case, shock, again, is the consequence. So we have the operant behavior. And again, the key difference here is that when the operant behavior occurs, the consequence follows, and that's what causes the learning. And again, that's the key difference between this and classical conditioning, where in classical conditioning, if the dog salivated, nothing happened. Maybe they got food, maybe they didn't. It wasn't a consequence of the salivation. Here, the food is a consequence of that lever press occurring. So in this situation, if this was the consequence that followed the lever press, if this was the consequence that followed the operant behavior, this would lead to the future probability of that lever press increasing. So you would likely get more lever presses in the future if your lever press was followed by the presentation of food. If the consequence of the lever press was that Sniffy, in this case, got food. So the future probability of lever presses increases. On the other hand, as you can imagine, if the lever press led to a shock, when you press the lever, all of a sudden the floor is shocked, that would lead to a future probability of the lever press decreasing. So again, the consequence, the learning that occurs, is measured in terms of, does this behavior, operant behavior, go up in probability, or does the operant behavior go down in probability? Both are forms of operant conditioning. So we have the operant behavior, we have the consequences known as operant consequences. So the future probability of an operant behavior will either increase or decrease if learning is going on and the behavior is changing. It's either going to become more likely or less likely. And this is where we get our main definitions for what the consequences are. So a reinforcer. A reinforcer is a consequence that increases the future probability of an operant behavior. So this is a very important definition to hold on to as hard as you can, because in our everyday language, in our society, the idea of a reinforcer is usually something that's pleasant. It's usually something that somebody likes. It's usually something that people value. When we think of something that's reinforcing, we think of something that's empowering or makes us feel better. None of that is necessary in operational conditioning. The only definition of a reinforcer is that it's a consequence that increases the probability of that behavior occurring in the future. And that is all that it matters. And we're going to see that this is an important definition, because whether or not something is a reinforcer can change depending upon the situation. So we have the reinforcer consequence that increases the future probability. The opposite of that is a punisher, and a punisher is a consequence that decreases the future probability of the operant behavior that led to that operant consequence. All right, so lever press leads to food, operant behavior leads to the operant consequence of food. Future probability of lever presses increases. That means that food is a reinforcer. So typically when we think of food, we think, yeah, food's going to be a reinforcer. Food's going to be something that somebody wants. It's important to remember that a reinforcer only means that the probability of a lever press will increase. Not necessarily that it's something that somebody wants, not necessarily that it's something that somebody likes. The only definition is that it's a reinforcer if As a consequence, it makes the operant behavior more likely to occur. On the other hand, a shock in this case leads to a decrease in the probability of future lever presses. That means that shock in this case is a punisher. So be very careful with this because, again, we've already come with knowledge from our mainstream culture here, what is a punisher and what is a reinforcer. But in operational conditioning and in the psychology of learning, it's a very specific term. So a reinforcer, again, is anything that leads to an increase in the probability of a response. A punisher is anything that leads to a decrease in the probability of a response. Any questions so far? All good? All right. So a few more terms. So if food is a reinforcer, the terms that they have for that is lever press, which is the operant behavior. R there for response, but lever press is the operant behavior. Leads to food, which is the stimulus, but we put that little superset R on there to indicate that it's a reinforcer. All right, so that S superset R, don't read this as R leads to S superset R, because that makes no sense to us whatsoever as human beings. Read this as the operant behavior is followed by the reinforcer for this one. So S superset R, that's the reinforcer. If shock is a punisher, we indicate that by S superset P, indicating that shock is a punisher, meaning that if shock follows a lever press, if the shock is a consequence of the lever press, that lever press will go down. All right, so the last basic term that we need is operant antecedents. And an operant antecedent is a stimulus that will signal the consequence of a behavior. So it's a stimulus that lets us know whether a behavior will lead to one consequence or whether a behavior will lead to another consequence. So the easiest popular example of an operant antecedent in our daily lives are traffic signals, right? A red light indicates that there's going to be a certain consequence to the behavior of proceeding through the intersection. A green light indicates that there's going to be a different consequence to the behavior of proceeding through the intersection. So operant antecedents are those stimuli that let us know when certain consequences are in effect. So if we play a tone, and after that tone, if a lever press occurs, or during that tone, if a lever press occurs, that would lead to food. That lever press is an operant antecedent that signals to the organism that a lever press under this condition is going to lead to the consequence of food, which is a reinforcer. So depending upon what the operant antecedent is signaling, it has different names. So in this case, it's known as a discriminative stimulus. Technically, a discriminative stimulus for reinforcement, but you can see that S subset D has just been decided as a convention that the D is going to be named as a discriminative stimulus, indicating that now this indicates that a reinforcement condition, a reinforcement consequence is in effect for the lever press. So that S with the subset D, superset D, that is the discriminative stimulus for reinforcement. And again, I highly recommend read it out as the discriminative stimulus for reinforcement. We also have discriminative stimuli for punishment. So a second tone, when the second tone is present, that might indicate or signal that the lever press will now lead to shock, right? So this is kind of the red light, right? Don't go do the lever press because it'll lead to shock. In this case, that tone is a discriminative stimulus for P, for punishment. So this would be an indication that the punishment protocol is in place. So that's a discriminative stimulus for punishment. And then the last operant antecedent that we have if you have a case where when a tone is sounded, the lever press will lead to the reinforcer of food. But when a light is present, the lever press will lead to nothing. So it doesn't lead to punishment. It doesn't lead to reinforcement. It just leads to nothing. You can lever press all you want, but you're not going to get any food. That's a discriminative stimulus. That's an operant antecedent. And this is the discriminative stimulus for extinction. So in this case, it leads to no food. There we go right there. So that's the discriminative stimulus for extinction, basically letting the rat know that you can press the bar all you want. Nothing is going to happen, so don't even bother. All right, so any questions on operant antecedents, operant behaviors, and operant consequences? Make sense so far? All right, let's keep going. So how do we use these operant behaviors, operant consequences, antecedent conditions to take somebody like this young piano player and take them all the way until they're a concert pianist? Well, one of the ways that we're going to see that this is done is by utilizing 4 different contingencies, 4 different types of contingencies. And after today, you are hopefully going to be one of the few people in our culture that actually knows what negative reinforcement is. Because I cannot count the number of times that I have heard people talk about their parenting styles or talk about their teaching styles, and they'll say things like, well, I believe in a lot of positive reinforcement. We use positive reinforcement with our child. You know, we're very, we like to be encouraging. We like to give them little rewards. We use a lot of positive reinforcement. We stay away from negative reinforcement. I really don't like to use negative reinforcement. And you like negative reinforcement like what? It's like, oh, we don't spank the child. We don't yell at the child. And I'm sitting there as a psychologist going, you don't know what negative reinforcement is. And in our society, almost nobody ever gets it right. So be prepared to be annoyed when you watch popular media. I absolutely love the movie Ghostbusters, and I cringe every single time that Dr. Venkman, who has a PhD in psychology, I don't know what university granted that PhD, gets negative reinforcement incorrect. So let's see the clip. Hopefully this one will work. And we'll see exactly what this is after we learn those contingencies. So he's conducting an experiment. He has dual PhDs in psychology and parapsychology. But he still doesn't know what negative reinforcement is. Yeah, it worked.
Trey, I want you to tell me what you think it is. Square. Good guess, but wrong. Clear your head. Right? Tell me what you think it is.
Is it a star?
It is a star. Very good. Great.
He's also not an ethical researcher.
Right. Think hard. What is it? Circle. Close. Spot definitely wrong. Okay. All right. Ready? What is it?
Figure 8.
Incredible. It's 5 for 5. You can't see these, can you?
No.
You're not cheating me, are you?
No, I swear they're just coming to me.
Okay. Nervous?
Yes. I don't like this.
You only have 75 more to go. Okay? What's this one?
It's a couple of wavy lines.
Sorry. This isn't your lucky day.
No. Get a little tired of this.
You volunteered, didn't you? We're paying.
electric shocks. What are you trying to prove here anyway?
I'm studying the effect of negative reinforcement on ESP ability.
No, he's not.
Effect? I'll tell you what the effect is. It's pissing me off. Well, then maybe my theory is correct. Okay, keep the $5 a head. I will, mister.
All right. So, not negative reinforcement. Okay, and after today, you will know exactly what negative reinforcement is, and you can go out into the world and correct your friends as required after today's class. So, there's 4 types of contingencies, and they are created by the combination of whether the contingency is positive or negative, and those things mean very specific things in operant conditioning, and whether they're followed by reinforcement or punishment. So those combinations of those 2 factors give us the 4 basic types of contingencies that are used in operant conditioning. So, what are these 4 types of contingencies? Well, remember that they are defined as the consequences. So they always follow the behavior. So you have a behavior that you either want to increase the probability of or decrease. This is your operant behavior. And if the consequence of that operant behavior is that you present something, you give something, you introduce something to the organism, that is a positive contingency. All right, so the positive here doesn't mean that it's a good thing, doesn't mean that it's something that the organism likes, doesn't mean that it's culturally acceptable way to act in this particular situation, doesn't mean that it makes the organism feel good. It simply means that you have added something to this organism's environment. You have given this organism something as a consequence of that behavior. If that positive presenting of something leads to an increase in behavior, increases in behavior are due to reinforcement, hence we have positive reinforcement. So positive reinforcement is when you present something to the organism, that causes that behavior to increase, hence we have positive reinforcement. On the other hand, if the behavior occurs and is followed by something being presented, but that's something that is being presented, that's something that's being given to the organism, causes the behavior to decrease, then that is an example of positive, but behavior decreases, and that only happens during punishment. So positive punishment is when you present the organism with something after their behavior, and the probability of the behavior goes down. Positive because you presented something, punishment because the behavior went down. So those are the positive contingencies. The other 2 contingencies are both negative contingencies. And the negative contingencies, again, don't fall for the prepackaged other definitions of the word negative. There's nothing bad about the negative contingencies. There's nothing awful about the negative contingencies. There's nothing frowned upon by the negative contingencies. All that the negative means is that something is taken away. So the behavior occurs as a consequence of that behavior, something is taken away. If taking away something leads to an increase in that behavior occurring in the future, then that is negative reinforcement. Negative because you took something away, reinforcement because it led to an increase in the probability of that behavior. And then the last one here, you take something away, it leads to a behavior decrease in the future. That decrease is a punishment or a punisher. So we have taking something away leads to a decrease. That is negative punishment. So those are the 4 contingencies. And again, you can see that it's a combination of whether something is presented, positive contingencies, or something taken away, negative contingencies as a result of the behavior. And then does that lead to an increase or a decrease? And that gives us positive reinforcement, positive punishment, negative reinforcement, and negative punishment. So let's get some real world examples of this. We'll go back to our little piano player. So let's say that we are trying to teach this, this individual. Let's say the piano teacher is trying to teach this this student how to play scales correctly. All right, so she wants to encourage playing scales correctly. She wants the probability of correct scales to increase. She wants the probability of incorrect scales to decrease. That's what she's hoping to achieve from these lessons. So we have the discriminative stimulus of practice time. So I put this up here just to be as thorough as we can be. So this will only occur during practice time. This will only occur when the instructor is there. It's practice time. It's 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock. This is when she's going to have those contingencies in place for her playing that correct scale. So let's say that it is practice time and she plays the correct scale, and that is followed by the reinforcer of praise. So she plays the correct scale and the teacher's like, oh my goodness, way to go. That sounded amazing. That's what we wanted. Woo, you've done so well. Yay, high fives. She gets the praise. Probability of the correct scale increases in the future. So the correct scale is the operant behavior. The praise is a reinforcer, and we know that because the probability of her playing that correct scale has gone up in the future. What contingency is this? So for when you're figuring out contingencies, you always start with the behavior. And you ask yourself, what is going on when that behavior is occurring? Right? What is going on when the behavior is occurring? So specifically here, when that behavior is occurring, when she's playing that scale, there's no praise, right? There's no, it's not a pre-existing condition of her situation, right? She is living in a praise-free moment when she's playing that scale. As soon as she's done that scale, the consequence of it is positive. Again, not because it's something that she likes or it's because it's a good thing or it's a valued behavior. It's positive because when she's done that scale, something new is introduced into her environment. New noises, new speeches, new words, praise words are being introduced to her environment. That makes it a positive contingency. What happens after that? She's more likely to play that scale in the future. She's more likely to play the scale correctly in the future. So that behavior increases. So this is an example of positive reinforcement. And in our society, when people say, oh, I believe in positive reinforcement, typically they're correct, right? The things that they say, oh, I like to reward my child for this, I like to praise them for this. Yes, that is positive reinforcement because after a behavior, something is being presented, in this case praise, that leads to an increase in behavior. That's positive reinforcement. So far, so good? All right. Let's say that another contingency that is in effect during practice time is that if she plays the incorrect scale, right? So incorrect scale is an operant behavior, one that the teacher is hopefully trying to reduce. And let's just say that this teacher, when she plays an incorrect scale, introduces scorn, right? So if you play like dun 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 dun, right? The teacher will be like, oh my goodness, that's the worst I've ever heard. Why are you even playing the piano? You should give up now. I want to go. I was like, let's not do any further. All right, so let's say that the teacher does that. We're going to see later on, this is not an effective way of changing behavior. But let's just say that that's what the contingency was. You do play the incorrect scale. Scorn is heaped upon this student. Once again, we have the behavior, the incorrect scale. And always, always, always ask yourself about this situation that is in effect when this behavior is occurring. Because in order to figure out if something is introduced or if something is taken away, you have to know what's there when the behavior is occurring. So when this behavior is occurring, there's no scorn. It's not like the teacher's already yelling at this particular student. It's not like they're already saying, you're worthless, you're horrible, stop playing the piano. Teacher is silent. Scale is being played. When the behavior is finished, when that incorrect scale is played, the teacher presents something. So this scorn is actually a positive contingency. Yelling at this child after she made a mistake is actually a positive contingency. And again, not because it's a good idea, not because it's socially acceptable, but because something was presented to this student. What was presented was scorn, and the probability of her playing that incorrect scale in the future is going to decrease. So you present something, probability of that incorrect behavior decreases, we have positive punishment. So when most people say, oh, I don't believe in negative reinforcement. I don't believe in yelling at my child. I don't believe in spanking my child. What they're really saying is, I don't believe in positive punishment. Okay, but it's been twisted around in our society. This is what most people think negative reinforcement is. It's not. So we have to be very careful to kind of unlearn what our society has taught us so that we can know what is actually meant by these contingencies. All right, any question about the positive contingencies? All right, let's take a look at some of the negative contingencies. Let's say that her parents are there during practice time. And when they hear the correct scale, right, they go to her and they say, you know what? That scale was so amazing, you don't have to eat your vegetables tonight. I know that most of the time we make you eat your vegetables. That's something that you do every night. We know that you don't like it. So guess what? As a reward, no broccoli for you tonight. You don't have to eat it during dinner. Correct scale is played. Consequence is no broccoli. Reinforcer, because the probability of that correct scale is going to go up in the future. In this case, we have a behavior. While this behavior is being done, she is living in a you have to eat your broccoli environment. All right? She is living in a world where she is going to have to eat her broccoli. When she's done this behavior, that requirement to eat broccoli gets taken away. That takeaway is what makes it a negative contingency. So prior to this behavior, she was going to have to do something to eat the broccoli. After the behavior, that requirement got taken away. That's a negative contingency. This is going to lead to an increase in the correct scale being played. Negative contingency leading to a behavior increase. This is negative reinforcement. And this is actually a very effective way to increase a behavior. So if anybody says they don't believe in negative reinforcement, if they truly meant that they didn't believe in negative reinforcement, that would be a really bizarre, thing to believe in. It's actually quite pleasant, and this individual would actually quite like it if she didn't have to eat her broccoli that day. So again, ask yourself, what is her situation during the behavior, and how does it change after the behavior? That's going to let you know whether something's negative or positive. And then the final one we have here, during practice time, again, her parents are listening in, and they hear an incorrect scale, right? They hear her daughter play the scale wrong, and they say, oh my goodness, we practiced so hard and you failed during this time. Guess what? No dessert for you tonight. That ice cream that we have every night, you can forget it. No dessert for you tonight. So the no dessert is a punisher, and the probability of the incorrect scale goes down. Let me make that example a little bit more technically clear. Let's say that they didn't actually heap any scoring on her. They just heard the incorrect scale, and they're like, guess what? No dessert for you tonight. Okay, so they've taken away dessert, and that leads to a decrease in that incorrect scale being played. We have her behavior, and when she's doing this behavior, when she's playing that incorrect scale, she is living in a dessert-eating world. Her situation is that she's going to get dessert after dinner. That's the world that she lives in. That's the environment that she lives in. Once that behavior is completed, dessert gets taken away. That makes it a negative contingency. Something got taken away from her. That takeaway is going to lead to a decrease in the behavior, a decrease in the probability of playing an incorrect scale. Decrease when something's taken away. That's negative punishment. All right, so any questions on those 4 contingencies? All right. So, in the Ghostbusters, Peter Venkman's horribly unethical experiment, we have the experimental condition, the discriminative stimulus for punishment. Should be a P up there. Incorrect predictions. All right, remember, nothing happened when you got a correct prediction. So there was no consequences to correct predictions. The only consequence that was in effect was for incorrect prediction. So for the incorrect prediction, that's the operant behavior, that led to shock. Shock was the punisher. He was seeing if the shock led to a decrease in those incorrect behaviors. So what is this contingency here? He said it was negative reinforcement. It's not. Try to figure out which of the 4 contingencies this one actually is. And any ideas? What was that?
Positive punishment.
Positive punishment. So this one is an example of positive punishment. And again, most people that get negative reinforcement wrong confuse it with positive punishment because the behavior was the incorrect prediction. Prior to that incorrect prediction, that individual was living in a shock-free environment, right? He was not getting shocked at all prior to his behavior. After the behavior, that incorrect prediction, something was presented to him, voltage, going through his body. That led to a decrease in the behavior, or theoretically a decrease in that incorrect prediction. Hence, this contingency was designed to be positive punishment. All right, so any final questions on the 4 types of contingencies? Yep.
So even if behavior doesn't decrease, but it's supposed to, is that positive? Because he was giving him the shock to prevent him from getting it wrong. And
Yes.
getting it wrong.
Yeah. So this would be, your question is kind of tied into what is a punisher and what isn't a punisher, and whether operant conditioning occurs if the behavior doesn't change. Because what he was doing in this case was he was placing a contingency upon a behavior that you just couldn't learn. It was kind of like an unlearnable behavior. So I would say technically this would just be a positive contingency, because if there's no change in behavior, because the probability doesn't go down, technically it wouldn't be positive punishment. So that's a good catch on that. But the kind of theoretically, the expectation was that the shock would cause it to go down, which would make it a positive punishment contingency. But you're absolutely right, and that's a good catch. And this is something to remember: whether something is punishment or whether something is reinforcement only depends upon whether the behavior goes up or whether the behavior goes down. So shock is something that is oftentimes used as a punisher, because shock is almost universally unpleasant to most organisms, right? However, it's not always unpleasant to most organisms. So there was actually experiments done where rats were implanted with electrodes that stimulated the pleasure centers in their brains every single time they pressed the bar, right? So it was literally like releasing dopamine, into your directly into your brain, like you're getting straight injected with dopamine straight into your brain every single time that they pressed the bar. And these rats would just go crazy pressing these bars. Like they would just sit there pressing the bar, pressing the bar, pressing the bar, pressing the bar, and you couldn't distract them from it. So these they had to be taken off the experiment because they weren't eating, right? So they were pressing the bar, and it was like, hey, you want some food? You're starving. And they're like, no, pressing the bar, pressing the bar, pressing the bar, pressing the bar. And the funniest thing is when they put other rats who were ready to mate, and were giving off all the pheromones and signals and everything that said, hey, I'm right here. Come mate with me. These rats were still like, no, pressing the bar, pressing the bar, pressing the bar, all because they were getting shocks in their brain. So shock isn't always a bad experience. It isn't always something that is a punisher, but oftentimes, though, shock is kind of one of the universal ones that does not, that leads to a decrease in behavior. All right. Last thing we're going to talk about today, shaping. So shaping is one of the last kind of principles of operant conditioning that theoretically is not necessary, but in practical ways makes operant conditioning possible. So what shaping is it is where you gradually create a new behavior through successively getting closer and closer and closer to that new behavior, right? So it's the gradual creation of your target operant behavior, not by jumping to it immediately, but by getting closer and closer and closer to it, and that's the procedure known as shaping. So it's not theoretically required, but it makes it practically possible. So theoretically, if you wanted to teach this little girl who is at her first piano lesson, and you wanted to teach her to play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, right? You wanted to teach her to be like dun 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 dun, dun 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 dun, dun 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 dun, right? You want to teach her to play that. Theoretically, just like a million monkeys on a million typewriters will eventually write out one of Shakespeare's plays, right? Just like they have that thought experiment. At some point, when she's sitting down at that piano, she will just randomly play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. So if you just sit her down and you say, all right, just bang the keys, right? She'll be like, plank, plank, plunk, plunk, plunk. And you'll be like, nope, not going to positively reinforce that. Don't want that behavior to increase. You'd be like, try again. Plank, 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 plunk, plunk. And be like, nope, not going to reinforce that. Try again, try again, try again. And eventually, she's going to sit there and you're going to be like, all right, try again. And she'll be like, dun, 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 dun. And you'll be like, yes, yay, woo, way to go. And the probability of that is going to go up. The problem with that is that it's going to take you over 1 billion years before she randomly puts those notes together, right? It's just not feasible. I mean, just literally it would take you sitting there for 1 billion years, and we would have absolutely no piano players. So how do we get her there faster? How do we get her there in a timely, practical manner? Well, we use shaping. We don't try to teach her Beethoven's Fifth all at once. We try to get her to the next step, and then the next step, and then the next step. So what we do is we see where she is down here. First piano lesson, doesn't know how to do anything. We want to get her all the way up there. We want to get her to the point where she's a concert pianist, where she can play, professional music. So what we do is we start taking a look at the behaviors that she can do. And that's the key here. We take a look at the behaviors that she can already do. And we take a look at those and we say, which of those behaviors are getting me closer to this point over here? So we might say, you know what, put your fingers on the keys. And she'll put her fingers on the keys. And sometimes she's going to put her fingers on the keys in the wrong position. And we would say, no, 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 no. That's no good. That's a positive punishment. She put her fingers on the wrong keys. We introduced, no, no, no. That leads to a decrease in the probability of fingers on the wrong keys. So that'll go fingers on the wrong keys, some fingers on the wrong keys. This one over here is fingers on the right keys. And every single time she puts her fingers on the right keys, you'll say, oh, wow, way to go, wonderful, woo, let's try that again. And the probability of her doing that goes up and up and up. And what happens is the probability, and all of you piano players will know this, the probability of you doing things wrong will go down over time as you get punished for them. The probability of doing something right will go up over time as you get rewarded for it, to the point where you'll just do that 100% of the time. So if you sit down to a piano and they're like, put your hands on the keys, it'll just be boom. 100% of the time, that's the behavior you have. So at that point, this is now her new position. That is her new behavioral set. Then you start teaching her scales. And you say, all right, we're going to try some scales. And that's going to be her behavior when she's playing the scales. So she's got her hands in the right position. You say, start playing some scales. She's going to be like, dun, dun, ding, bum, bing. And you'll be like, no, no, no. That's going in the incorrect direction, right? That's taking us further away from our goal. That's in the incorrect direction. So she tries again. Dun, 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 dun. And you're like, yes, there we go. So you reinforce the behaviors that are pushing you towards that final target operant behavior. What happens is that the probability of these incorrect behaviors goes down. The probability of this correct behavior goes up. So again, these incorrect behaviors would either be punished or they can be completely ignored, go through extinction. The correct behavior gets reinforced. Eventually, that correct behavior will become highly probable, will always occur. So when you ask somebody, can you play a scale? They're like, yeah, whatever. Da, 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 da. So then you start doing more complicated behaviors. And all of the time that you're doing this, you're taking into, you're using her natural variability in behaviors. So every organism, every person will have a natural variability in behaviors, especially when they're trying out new behaviors. So the first few times you try something, you'll do it in a bunch of different ways. And what you do is you get punished for the ways that you do it wrong. You get rewarded for the ways that you do it right. And as you keep doing this, as we keep teaching this student more and more stuff, eventually she's going to get to the point where she's almost a concert pianist, trying to play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. This is her playing it completely correctly. This is her getting some notes wrong. This is her playing it without feeling. Decrease the probability of those incorrect performances, increase the probability of the correct performance, and eventually you get her to that final target behavior of playing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and you don't have to wait around for a billion years for her to randomly fall upon that particular behavior. So this is something that you're going to be doing, and I'll go over some tips and techniques post-exam. But this is something that you'll be doing with Sniffy, because you're going to have to get Sniffy to bar press. One of the more challenging assignments that you'll be doing in Sniffy is trying to get Sniffy to learn how to bar press. And as you're going to see, if you just wait for Sniffy to press that bar, right? Sniffy will wander around his room, and at some point, Sniffy will press that bar. The problem is if you wait for Sniffy to press the bar in order to reinforce him with food, you're literally going to take days to do this assignment. It's going to take you a long time to sit there and watch that screen and go, is he going to press it? Is he going to press it? Is he going to press it? Oh, he pressed it. Give him some food. I got another 3 hours. Let me see if he presses it again. Right? It's going to take you forever. But if you go through shaping, if you say, all right, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to see what Sniffy's natural behavior is. Oh, Sniffy kind of walks around the room a little bit, walks around his little Skinner box. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reinforce him when he's near the bar, right? When he's in the back half of the box. And then when he gets to the back half of the box, you reinforce him. You say, hey, here's some food. When he's in the front half of the box, you don't reinforce him, no food. Pretty soon he's going to be spending more time in the back half of the box. And then you say, all right, now that he's in the back half of the box, let me see if I can reinforce him when he's near the bar. So when he's over to one side, you don't reinforce him. When he's near the bar, here's some food. When he's over on the other side, you don't reinforce him. Pretty soon he's going to spend more time around the bar. And then you say to yourself, all right, sometimes he's on all fours. Sometimes he's standing up. You need to stand up to press the bar. I'm going to reinforce him when he stands up. So you're not going to wait for Sniffy to just go ahead and press that bar. What you're going to do is you're going to identify some behaviors that he's doing and just gradually, just like this little girl here, gradually bring him along until the point where he's pressing the bar. And after that, you'll see that the probability of that bar press will increase and increase. All right, any questions, excuse me, on shaping? Okay, so that's it for what I wanted to cover today. So unless my fever-addled brain is tricking me, next class is the optional review session. Yes? I guess I'm okay. I'm still fighting off a fever. So next time is the optional review class. I'm going to catch up on all my emails. I apologize if I haven't gotten to you in the last few days. If you have specific questions that you want covered in that class, let me know. Send me through Canvas messages. If you don't, just bring your questions to class. Want to make sure that everybody's ready for exam number 2. But it is optional, so if you decide that you don't, you're better off preparing in another way, feel free to, do that. I won't be taking attendance that day, but it is just a section that I've dedicated to hopefully stop that little experiment 2 dip